Welcome, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us tonight. I'm Julia Watts-Belser, Associate Professor of Jewish Studies at Georgetown University, and it is my tremendous pleasure to host tonight's lecture with Dr. Grace Ji-Sun Kim, who will be speaking about her brilliant new book, Invisible: Theology and the Experience of Asian American Women. Tonight's lecture is the result of a wonderful partnership between Georgetown University's Women's Center and the Department of Theology and Religious Studies. So many thanks to both our sponsors. I want to give special thanks to my fabulous co-organizer at the Women's Center, Annie Selleck, for all her work in bringing this event to fruition, and for making it possible for Georgetown students to request a free copy of Dr. Kim's book. So Georgetown students, please do remember, if you haven't already, to pick up your copy at the Women's Center if you requested a book. Thanks also to Daviana Soberanis for the wonderful graphic design for tonight's event. Thank you to our ASL interpreters and our CART captioner. Tonight's event has live real-time captioning. To enable captions in our Zoom screen, please click the CC button on your bottom Zoom bar. If you have any questions or need help with captioning, please feel free to reach out using the Q&A function. We'll be having a questions and answer period at the end of Dr. Kim's talk tonight. So you are warmly welcome and encouraged to submit your questions at any time via the Q&A function in the webinar. Finally, most importantly, thank you to Dr. Grace Ji-Sun Kim for accepting our invitation to be with us tonight. Grace Ji-Sun Kim is a professor of theology at Earlham School of Religion and an ordained minister in the Presbyterian Church USA. She's one of the leading contemporary voices writing and teaching today at the intersection of theology and social justice, working to develop a Christian theology that's responsive to questions of racial justice, gender justice, ecological responsibility, global solidarity, and more. She is a prolific and powerful writer, the author or editor of 20 books, including Hope in Disarray, piecing our lives together in faith, Intersectional Theology, and Planetary Solidarity, Global Women's Voices on Christian Doctrine and Climate Justice. Dr. Kim regularly writes for popular news outlets like Sojourners, Time, The Huffington Post, Christian Century, and The Nation. She'll be speaking tonight about her latest book, Invisible: Theology and the Experience of Asian American Women. Her lecture tonight is titled Invisible: Racism, Sexism, and Xenophobia. Welcome. Welcome to Georgetown, and thank you, Dr. Kim.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bessler and Dr. Selleck and Dr. Mina Cho. Thank you so much for the invitation. It's such an honor to be with you today. And Dr. Julia Bessler, just thank you so much for that warm introduction. I am just so my heart is so warmed for all the kind words that you said about me. And it's such an honor and joy to be with you all today. Thank you to all the students that have joined us. And I look forward to the Q&A session at the end of my talk. I am going to use a PowerPoint, so let me just start this screen share. So as Dr. Julia Bessler has mentioned, my talk is Invisible: Racism, Sexism, and Xenophobia. So I'm grateful to the Women's Center for giving free books to all the students. I hope you can, those who have not had a chance to pick it up, that you will pick it up. So I want to begin my talk by going over some of the history of Asian and Asian immigration in the US. So the first Asians in America arrived in the 1500s with the Filipinos in California. And then almost 200 years later, Chinese immigrants arrived in Hawaii. And soon after, we have Japanese immigrants and who came during the gold rush. And we also have Korean immigrants who also went to Hawaii and to California. So many did come during the gold rush. And during this gold rush, in California, they imposed a tax on all foreign miners. So the white immigrants who were already here weren't taxed, but the Chinese workers especially were heavily taxed during this time. The Supreme Court in 1854 further ruled that Chinese could not testify for or against whites in the court. So if they were experiencing any difficulty, they could not testify against whites in the court system. So they were working for low wages and in dangerous positions, and they were fined heavily for when they were working. There were also the Chinese immigrants were working on the railroad and also were working as indentured workers. As indentured workers, you were not paid for the labor. It was a payment for coming into the United States. And for the railroad workers, there were white workers and Chinese workers. The white workers were paid higher wages, and the Chinese workers were paid measly wages, and they had to pay for all their food. So after they paid for their food, there was basically nothing left for them as they worked building the railroad. Also, the dangerous jobs were assigned to the Chinese workers, like blowing up the dynamite. So many of the Chinese workers lost their lives as they were building the railroad. When we think about the Asian immigrant history, we see a lot of racism, just as I have described so far. So racism has been used by dominant white society to maintain its status and cultural influence. Racism favors the dominant group and keeps the subordinate group in their lower status. So racism pushes Asian Americans into the margins. So as I have in the picture beside my PowerPoint, it says equal rights to all men, but we know that that was not true. It was not equal for the Asian immigrants that came. And I must state that most of the early Asian immigrants that came were mostly men. So Americans needed workers, so many of them came as laborers. It was very difficult for women to come. And the few women that came were either viewed as sex workers or ended up working as sex workers. So when we think about racism here in America, and we see what happens to Asian immigrants, they were pushed to the margins. They weren't given the equal opportunity as other immigrants who came into this land. Racism causes exclusion or vulnerability. People are made powerless by members of society from basic social equality and opportunity. When we think about racism, through racism, privileged groups dominate smaller or more vulnerable groups. So we see this happening against Asian and Asian Americans, that the white dominant society use their power. And so those people of color, which includes Asian Americans, Black, Native Americans, and Hispanics, are made very vulnerable. Racism has been woven into the American culture. It perpetuates the values of those who feel a sense of entitlement. So when we think about racism, the white dominant society had a sense of entitlement. And so we see many of the laws that Congress had passed that have been very racist. And we see this throughout immigrant history. Racism, there is also covert racism, often appearing as microaggressions, and they can be subconscious or even non-deliberate, but these actions do happen, and a lot of it happens to the Asian American community. Microaggressions are common verbal and behavioral actions that are subtle, but also very hostile and derogatory. If you read my book, I do share some of these experiences of microaggression that I have experienced as an immigrant. So to say a little bit about my own immigrant history, I was actually born in Korea, and in 1975, our family immigrated to Canada. So I started kindergarten in Canada all the way up to my doctoral work. And then in 2004, after I was married and had children, then I moved to the US to start teaching. But the microaggressions are very present, and that is all part of the racism. Racism against Asian Americans is seldom recognized. And that's because here in the US, racism is mostly talked about in Black and white terms. And so those who fall in between are usually not part of the conversation. So racism against Asian Americans are rarely recognized. And also, furthermore, terms such as perpetual foreigners, honorary whites, model minority have been used to minimize the Asian American plight, rendering their experiences peripheral, invisible, and non-existent. So these terms, some of them, which I will explain further in the presentation, have been used to always tell us Asian Americans that our experiences of racism are not racist because we are honorary whites, as if there is a hierarchy of people. So whites are at the top. So if you're honorary white, it is impossible for Asian and Asian Americans to experience any form of racism. Now to move into sexism, the image I have is the image of Madame Butterfly. And I kind of put it in there to exemplify how Asian American women have been portrayed here from the beginning of our immigrant history. There has been prejudice, stereotyping, or discrimination, typically against women on the basis of sex. And then when we think about Asian American women in particular, the concept of obedience is important. So women's obedience to men, especially in Confucian culture. So in simple terms, in Confucianism, girls were told to obey their fathers. Women, when you married, obeyed your husband. And when you became a widow, you obeyed your sons. So throughout the life of women, women were always told to obey men in their life. So their father, then their husband, and then their sons. So there is this culture of obedience. And so the sexism, this patriarchal culture, we have to recognize how this plays out. And as immigrants, this underlying Confucian thinking and understanding still comes with us. And many women, Asian American women, kind of live in this culture where we are expected to obey. And when we think about in our religious context, women and the church, women, we occupy male spaces. Women often face degradation at the hands of male church leadership. Women's leadership or authority was not fully accepted in Korean and many Asian immigrant churches. And that's all because it's all tied in together, the sexism and the racism. So women are occupying male spaces. When we think about religion, particularly Christianity, it is a very patriarchal patriarchal religion. And some denominations will allow women to hold leadership positions, even ordain women. But we also experience other denominations like the Roman Catholic Church and a few other denominations that will not allow women to hold leadership positions. And so with the Asian American community, with the culture of obedience, it is very difficult for women to hold leadership positions in the church. Asian American women face subjugation, and we're living in a very conservative, patriarchal ethnic community, and there's also the discrimination from Western culture. Another book that I wrote is Intersectional Theology, which I wrote with Dr. Susan Shaw. And in that book, we want to emphasize the intersectionality of these issues. So when I talk about racism, and now that I'm talking about race and sexism, these are all interrelated. So we have to keep that in mind, the intersectionality of these issues and how we ourselves are very intersectional human beings. I am an able Korean woman, heterosexual and educated woman, and all of us have different identities. And when we think about intersectionality, these identities, our understanding of who we are and how we fit in culture are very important, because there are oppressions that work against one another in terms of intersectionality. These forces of marginalization take a toll on Asian Americans' women's wellness and well-being. Asian American women are subject to religious and cultural patriarchy that contribute to the lack of visibility in society and the church. So we need to overcome sexism because of the wellness, our well-being of women. Asian American women depends on overcoming sexism. One of the ways I suggest in the book is that we need to move away from a patriarchal understanding of God. We keep talking about God in male terms, Father as he, using he pronouns. So we need to move away from it. And also, I would say, in addition to that, move away from the whiteness of God. You know, God is not male, God is not white, but Christianity itself in the last 2,000 years have perpetuated this whiteness of God and the male understanding of God. One way to move away from that is using wisdom language or spirit language about God. So wisdom traditionally is feminine. So we want to move away from the patriarchal language. So in the Old Testament, we have Chokmah. In the New Testament, we have Sophia language as wisdom. And we want to use spirit language, which moves away from the gendered language of God. Now, moving to xenophobia, the Greek word xeno means stranger or foreign, and phobos means fear or flight. So xenophobia is fear and hatred of foreigners. So this is all tied in with the racism that I talked about earlier, but now I'll focus a bit about how the white dominant society is fearful of immigrants, particularly Asian immigrants, and then that feeds into the racism and feeds into legalized kind of discrimination that has happened throughout Asian American history. So we have a long history of using the language of disease to justify xenophobia. So on the left side of the screen, there the image of fear, plague, fear, and politics in San Francisco Chinatown. So Chinese were forced to live in overcrowded urban areas, Chinatowns, and were often associated with filth, disease, and immorality. Sensational print media about disease and depravity in San Francisco Chinatown found widespread acceptance. As Chinese population grew in 1850 to 1880, so did xenophobia and racism directed towards them. So we have this long history of using discrimination to justify xenophobia. On the left is an image of a Chinese man, and the words are, "They must go," you know, and then let me read the PowerPoint. Chinese immigrants were racialized as dog eaters and other vermin like rats and mice. 1875 to 76, the smallpox outbreak happened, and the Chinese and the Asian American community were blamed. 1900s, the bubonic plague, many were blamed the Asian Americans. And we see this happening even today with the COVID pandemic, that Asian Americans are blamed. And this was done through politics, through Trump, and through other forms in social media. So what happened 100 years ago is repeating itself even today. Chinese immigrants were accused of stealing jobs from white men and were seen as genetic carriers of all sorts of diseases. So we see the xenophobia happening and the blaming of Chinese, and the Chinese gets extended to other Asian immigrants, that we are stealing people's jobs and that we are causing different outbreaks and pandemics. And that led to the Chinese Exclusion Act. So xenophobia promotes an irrational fear and hatred of immigrants that often results in the demonization of the foreigner. Chinese came as indentured workers, and many became afraid of them. So this led to the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which meant that no Chinese were allowed to come into the United States from 1882. And that was supposed to stay in for 10 years, and then it kept getting extended and extended. There was much anti-Chinese sentiment or xenophobia. And we see that during COVID-19 pandemic, with the rise of anti-Asian racism and also the anti-Asian hate, the fear of Chinese or all Asians is rampant. And we're still experiencing that as we are still in this pandemic. Xenophobia drives nativism, the naming of white Anglo-Saxon Protestant settlers and their descendants as natives to United States, ignoring the indigenous population. So white people, white settlers, white immigrants suddenly are called natives, and we forget about what happened to the Native American population here in this land. White nativism feeds into white supremacy, instilling hatred and fear towards other races and other people. And this all leads to legal discrimination. Yellow peril, the fear of immigrants from East Asia, based on the misunderstanding that East Asians are a danger to the Western world. We are a danger. We take people's jobs. There may be interracial marriage. We bring plagues and disease and pandemic. Yellow peril is used against Asian immigrants to cement their place as subordinates, and suffered intense discrimination and violence, culminating in lynching and large-scale assaults. So we often forget about the attacks and the assaults that have happened to the Asian American community. When we think about how people came into the US, Europeans entered through Ellis Island in New York. And when they came, many of them only waited a couple hours, or maybe a few slept overnight before they were allowed to enter the country. Many of them were poor. They were fleeing other loss of jobs, famine, and so forth, but they were processed very, very quickly in Ellis Island. When we compare that to Asians, Asians entered through Angel Island in San Francisco Bay, which was run much like a prison. So if you have a chance, maybe you have gone through and visited Angel Island. I have visited Angel Island, and it feels like a prison. There is fencing, barbed wiring, and when you go inside, it feels like a prison. And many of them took weeks and months. Some of them spent years in there being processed. And so you see the difference between European immigration versus Asian immigration. Chinese massacre of 1817, about 17 to 20 Chinese immigrants were lynched. This is the largest mass lynching in American history, and we often forget that other groups of people were lynched here in American society. There was a sudden fear, and this lynching happened. I mentioned earlier about the Chinese Exclusion Act. So that was in place in 1882, and it lasted till 1943. So during that time, this prevented Chinese from becoming citizens, voting, or owning property. And they had to carry papers around. If they left US land, it was very hard for them to come into the land. And when we think about this Chinese Exclusion Act, it also got extended to other Asian communities. So when we think about voting rights, we often just associate that with the African American community. But it was only very recent in 1943 that the Chinese Americans were finally allowed to vote. And when we think about 2018, the Muslim ban against that Trump had instilled, the Muslim ban was put in place for 7 countries. So the Chinese Exclusion Act forbade immigration from China, denied naturalization of Chinese immigrants, and denied citizenship to American-born children of Chinese immigrants. This denial of citizenship actually went against the 14th Amendment, which guarantees citizenship to all children born in the US. So that was the only group. Chinese were the only group really excluded legally. And we cannot forget about the Japanese internment that happened from 1942 to 1946. We were in war with other countries, but only the Japanese were interned. They lost their property, they lost all that they had, and they were put into these internment camps. So 1943, it signifies 61 years of suffering. Congress finally repealed the Exclusion Act in 1943 and allowed 100 foreign-born Chinese a year to seek naturalization. In 1943, the Chinese were finally allowed to become US citizens and were allowed to vote. Other forms of discrimination and that feeds into the xenophobia is a model minority myth. In the 1960s, sociologists who were trying to fight against communism thought of making Asian Americans into a model minority myth. And so that's where it rose, and it still continues to play today. It basically says that we are better than the other people of color. So what it does is it pits us Asian Americans against African Americans, against Hispanics and Latin Americans. And we don't want to be in that situation. We are not the model minority. We are not going to serve as a model minority to help the white community. In all these ways, because of the racism against Asian Americans and how the model minority myth feeds into the fact that, hey, because you go to the top schools, hey, because you have high earning jobs, you are the model minority. But if anyone visits Flushing, we know that so many Asians and Asian Americans are living in poverty. People are living in rundown buildings, sharing bathrooms and kitchens with other families. We do not go into the top universities. So it is a myth. But what the myth does is it makes us seem like we don't experience any form of racism or discrimination. And in many ways, that makes us invisible in this white dominant society. Asian Americans are made invisible in a culture that tries to eliminate their experiences of racism and discrimination. Invisibility is a society issue and a spiritual issue. So because we are made invisible, and that's why I called this book Invisible. Actually, if you ask many Asian and Asian Americans here in US, we always have this common experience of being made invisible. And so it is a common experience. And when we think in the spiritual realm too, our voices are marginalized even within Christianity and spirituality. So we need to work on a theology of visibility. So I've spent most of my presentation talking about the negative things of racism and sexism and xenophobia and the legal forms of discrimination that has happened in this American society. I do want to end on a positive note, working towards a theology of visibility. And it will take us one step closer to eliminating the evils of racism, discrimination, sexism, and xenophobia. So I just want to go over 4 key Asian terms, and they are explained a lot more deeply in the book. So for lack of time, I'll just go over these very quickly. So the 4 terms are Uri, Han, Chong, and Chi. So Uri means our, Han means unjust suffering, Chong is the sticky love, and Chi is an Asian concept that signifies spirit. So Uri means in the Asian culture, the community overrides individualism in Asian society. Uri is a plural possessive, which means our. In the Korean language, the possessive noun mine is seldom used. So in Korea, we rarely say my book or my church or my school. We will say our school, our family, our church, our building, etc. And even if you are married so for example, I'm married to one husband. In Korean language, we don't say my husband, we will say our husband, even though it's one husband and one wife, or one partner and the other partner, one spouse, etc. So when we think about language does provide insight, because this concept of community is very important and it will help us. When we think about Christianity, Christianity is a religion not about me, but rather it is about us, one that prioritizes the inclusion and care of all peoples. So we need to move away from the me and move towards our or Uri. The word Uri forces us to look at community, the body of Christ, and the communion of saints. Living in a culture of Uri alters our perspective of God. When we think about chi is spirit. It is similar to the Hebrew term and the Greek term ruha and pneuma as found in the Christian text. Chi is a spirit which we find in our bodies. It is all around us, the spirit around us. Chi is life-giving spirit that is part of our daily task. When we die, chi leaves our bodies and makes us cold. So chi is what gives us warmth and what gives us life. So Chong is a difficult word to translate into Korean, but it can be understood as love. It permeates the lives of Koreans. It is part of what gives joy, attachment, and meaning to many people's lives. Chong includes affection, attachment, compassion, kindness, sharing, connection, and sympathy to people and even objects. The experience of Chong flows out of you to the other to cause connectedness, affection, and love. So it is this connectedness. So Chong and Uri, I would like to connect and also connect that with the spirit understanding, this connectedness, because chi is all around us. It is within me and you. And Chong is what connects us between you and me, and Uri is talking about community, ourness. So the sticky kind of love is difficult to untangle or separate oneself from, and thus makes us stay connected to one another. So that is how we connect ourselves together. Even though we may argue and fight, even among friends or family, Chong holds us together. Chong can be tied into the concept of the spirit and reminds us of our own connectedness to each other, to the spirit, and to God. We don't and we cannot live alone. We don't live in an island on our own. We live in community and require Chong to help us form bonds, connections, and feelings of love and being loved. The Spirit of God that draws us to live in peace with one another, encourage us to love our neighbor, and provokes us to reach out to love others. I think it's so important to love one another. And when we think about Chong, it's also towards matter and towards other material. So I would extend that we need to connect with all of creation. And that is always with deep in my heart with my work on climate change and creation care. The Korean word han expresses the pain and suffering that people and communities experience due to unjust systems such as racism, patriarchy, and colonialism. So going back to han is unjust system like racism and patriarchy that cause suffering. So when we think about Asian Americans and Asian American women in particular, we experience this deep suffering that's deep in our hearts. And, everyone suffers, but when there is systems that cause suffering, then that is what unjust suffering is. And that is what han is. So han, you can easily kind of define it as unjust suffering. So when I'm thinking about the theology of visibility, visibility is in the kingdom of God. Invisibility has no place in the kingdom of God. We are all created in God's image. Everyone, able, disabled, man, woman, heterosexual, homosexual, queer, it doesn't matter. Invisibility is a spiritual issue. We are all beautiful and made in the fullness of God, a creator God who loves diversity and relishes how each created person is so different from the other. So theology of visibility, the invisible God, the creator, became a human being and became visible through the incarnation. The visible God makes us all visible. This happens because we are all created in the image of the one infinite God. Thus, we need to view all peoples as equal. So as I was saying about Asian Americans, how we are made invisible. When we think about God, God makes us all visible and makes us all equal and asks of us to love, to share the Chong, to understand that we are in community, our Uri, and that the Spirit resides in all of us. So the theology of visibility reminds us that everyone is a child of God and all life is sacred. All of creation is sacred. The animals, the birds, the plant, the water, and the air. As such, we should love and embrace one another, not stereotype, racialize, discriminate against, nor hate anyone. As we live with sacredness, dignity, and love, we will recognize God who is among us and who embraces the invisible and actually makes us all visible. So thank you so much for listening to my short talk. I hope especially the students at Georgetown will get the free copy of Invisible, and we will have a moderated Q&A with Dr. Bessler. So thank you so much for listening.
Dr. Kim, thank you so much for a beautiful, powerful, in some parts really haunting talk where you took us through both the profound experiences of racism, xenophobia, and violence that Asian and Asian American communities have faced in the United States, and then shifted the frame to think with us about the ways that a theology of visibility can draw specifically on Asian theology and thinking, cultural values and insights to really lift up the dignity and visibility and interconnectedness, the sticky love. I love that. I love that term, the sticky love that binds us all together. So I'm seeing a number of questions already coming in. So I'll be glad to pose some of those questions to you. Maybe we can start with a question from Alina. Alina says, thank you so much for speaking to us today, and asks if you'd be willing to talk a little bit more about the model minority concept, how that has affected you personally, and what are some of the ways to deter or break apart this narrative?
Okay, so thank you for asking that question. I think it's a very important one, particularly now as during the pandemic and with the rise of AAPI hate and hate crimes that are being recorded by cell phone and by cameras on the street. For me personally, it has affected me a lot because, you know, I came as an immigrant. I was 5 years old, and you know, experiencing racism as soon as I landed in Canada, being called names, you know, the eye pulling. You know, we have Asian professors at Georgetown, and some of Asian American professors are listening and here in this lecture. You know, we have experienced this, and you know, when I name these experiences of racism, discrimination, and marginalization, what the model minority myth does is it keeps saying to our community, the Asian American community, you cannot be experiencing any forms of racism because you are the model minority. You are honorific white. You are almost like us. So whatever you're experiencing, stop complaining. Stop saying anything because you are all getting high-paying jobs. You are all living in big homes. You are all, you know, going to the best schools. But if you look at the statistics, you know, many Asian immigrants, Asian Americans are living in poverty. We don't have the high incomes. It is very, very difficult life. If you go to Chinatown in San Francisco or any of the major cities, and people living in Chinatown, they are very poor. So I think it has affected me personally a lot because every time I talk about my own experiences of racism or even write about it, I do blog and I do share some of these experiences. Still, the white dominant community will continue to tell me that that wasn't racism, that was not a form of discrimination because you are all doing well, so stop this. So I get this over and over again. So I think we need to move away from the model minority myth because it pits us. So white dominant society used it to say to Black people, just pull up and just, you know, just follow what Asian Americans are doing and you will do well, or to the Hispanic group or to the Native American group. And so everybody is fighting with one another. And when you're fighting with one another, it reinforces white supremacy. It plays out that way. And a classic example, you know, Trump did that all the time. He made everyone fight against one another. So that's exactly what this model minority myth does. And we need to stop, dismantle this, get rid of it, And we need to move towards this theology of visibility where we love one another. And I just, I gave this presentation and I love when Dr. Julia Bessler kind of summarizes it. She summarized it so much more beautifully. But the sticky love, we need to be able to love one another and understand the importance of community and the spirit. I teach at Earlham School of Religion, and I know some students and faculty are probably part of this talk too. Quakers have a saying, that of God in each other, that of God in you. The Spirit of God is in you and in me and in all of creation. And once we see that, then we can move away from the racism and discrimination, especially the legal discrimination that has happened here on American soil. So thank you so much for asking me that question.
Thank you. It's a really beautiful response. We're having a lot of questions come in, which is wonderful. Let me pick up a question from Elise, who was really taken by the connection you made between the rise in racism and xenophobia during the pandemic. And she asks, do you think, and I'm curious here too, especially given your knowledge of the history and the connection, the way this connection between pandemic, disease, and danger is not new in Asian American history. Do you see this rise that we've experienced in racism and xenophobia during the pandemic as something that will subside post-pandemic? Or do you think it is likely to stick around? How do you think about the arc of that experience?
I think, so that's another wonderful question. I think we don't know much of Asian American history. I raised 3 kids here in the US. They started here from kindergarten. They rarely know about it because it's not taught. So that's why we forget what happened when the plagues happened earlier in the pandemic, that the Chinese and the Asian Americans were blamed. And we see this happening throughout our American history. I'm always living in hope. So as you mentioned, my other book that came out before Invisible was Hope in Disarray. So I always live in hope. So my hope is that the arc will move so that the blame and the hate crimes will lessen. But when we look throughout history, the hate crimes have actually been there. As I shared about the lynching, there are so many other crimes. A Chinese woman, a pregnant woman, was pulled out of her house and dragged on the street by her hair and blamed for many issues. A lot of people were attacked. My parents owned a convenience store. Actually, in this book, I share so many stories. And when I was going through the copy editing, I was like, oh no, maybe I shared too much. And I thought I can't delete them now because then there'll be like half a book only left. So if you read the book, I share some stories, and I can't remember if I shared this story, but our parents ran a convenience store, and people came into the store and they attacked my parents on many occasions for no reason at all. And so these, and I remember on United Airlines, I don't know, 5 years ago or maybe more, when that Chinese doctor was brutally attacked because he was not going to get off the plane for someone else to get and take his seat. It was his seat. And, it brings back horror memories for myself when people, my parents were attacked for no reason physically. And I know that has happened to many Asian Americans. People are attacked. And so we see more attacks during the pandemic because it almost feels like it's okay to attack. So some of these viral videos, elderly women just walking on the street and being attacked because she's Asian American, because of the narrative, that Trump started, calling it the China flu, or I can't remember what other horrible names he used during his presidency, and it kind of stayed with us. It almost legitimized these hate crimes, either physical or verbal hate crimes. But we do need to kind of name them. People should be punished. People should be arrested. And those who are witnessing should help the victims and stop them. And I know in certain cases, I think in the West Coast, two people tried to stop a hate crime, and then I think one person died from helping an Asian American woman. But I'm always living in hope. So I hope when the pandemic dies down, that the hate crimes will subside. But we know history always repeats itself. So we must learn our history so we can stop these hate crimes from happening and continuing.
Thank you. I want to shift gears with some of the questions because I'm seeing a number of questions coming in now also about some of the theological ideas that you're speaking about. So let me start with one from Anjali, who asks, has a number of questions here, but I'll pick out just one, which is, you spoke about the experience of male domination within many Asian American churches. And she's curious about whether some of that experience has transformed or given rise to personal religious practice among Asian American women, and whether some of those practices might also, particularly women's practices, might serve as a kind of form of liberation or help work against domination and discrimination.
Yeah, another wonderful question. I am ordained PC, Presbyterian Church USA, and I'm part of the Korean Presbyterian Clergy Women's Association that's within the PCUSA. Among our groups, I don't know, there might be over 100, but many of us don't serve in a Korean church. There may be one or two. That's because, we have studied here. I teach, a few of these women teach, but then they're doing ministry in a non-Korean church or a non-Asian church, or doing chaplaincy work, because there is really no space because of all this long history of patriarchy, that it's really difficult for men to kind of learn from women, or the obedience factor. And in my book, I do share my horror story of being ordained, or the ordination process. So you can read into that because of lack of time. But I think practices that we may have, I think different denominations or different groups have practices. But one thing that is helpful is that we do get together either through Zoom during the pandemic and during busy times, and we do hold conferences. And so when we get together, and there are other organizations like Pan Autumn and a few other just Asian women, many of them may hold rituals, just small practices of solidarity and just things that ordinarily men would not practice. And I think just individually, people may hold rituals or practices that I may not be aware of. But I think in my case, many times because of the sexism and the discrimination I experienced in the Asian American churches, so many times I do wanted to leave. And, I spoke at Candler School and a few other seminaries with large Asian American students. And they always ask, why didn't you leave? Or how did you end up staying? Or how did you end up getting ordained? And part of my answer is, my faith is still there. It's not like I have lost my faith. And also it's easier to critique the church when you're still part of the church than when you leave the church. So that's how I continue to stay. And again, with hope that that me and others, we can be in solidarity to fight against patriarchy and use less patriarchal language. And, we do that in seminaries. We enforce it in seminaries as much as we can to move away from the male language and use inclusive language.
Thank you. Dr. Kim, I'm also seeing a lot of questions here about the theology of invisibility. A number of students are asking more about what theology of visibility might look like in practice, or if you can draw out a little bit more what some of the implications of that theology are.
Yeah, I thought I had my book, Embracing the Other, with me, but I think, I wrote this, and I didn't know at the beginning I was going to move into a theology of visibility. It just happened as I was writing. I thought, there are so many different forms of theology, and I never thought of doing this. But once I started writing the book, and I had to write it many times because in the middle of the book, my whole laptop crashed. So I lost bulk of my writing. So there was a lot of rewriting. And it suddenly led me to this theology of visibility. Because Asian Americans are made invisible, we can, and our experiences are ignored. Our political strength is not so strong here in the US. There is a lot, we don't have that much power. And we are only 6% of the American population, but we are the fastest growing population. So there will be more. 6% versus I think 13 or 14% African American. So we are smaller group, and we are made invisible in so many ways. And I thought that also puts a lot of stress on us physically, mentally, and also spiritually. That's why it becomes a spiritual issue for us. If we as a community are made to be made invisible, we experience this Han within us, and we do suffer physically and mentally and spiritually. So to move away from being made invisible and to be kind of liberated, I work on this theology of visibility using these 4 key Asian Korean terms to work towards a theology of visibility to overcome the racism and the discrimination. The book I mentioned earlier, Embracing the Other, was published, I think, 2015. Actually, it was a very popular book because I was surprised that not only seminaries invited me to speak on the book, but actually undergrad students and undergrad programs invited me to speak on that book. And I think looking back now, I didn't know it when I was writing the book, but after I completed it, I realized that this theology of visibility kind of began with my work. So that was about 6 years ago in Embracing the Other, because that really focuses on spirit and love. And so this theology of visibility is building on that, really focusing on love and spirit to say everyone is made visible in the kingdom of God. That no matter how we look like, no matter what our ability is, no matter what our education is, no matter whether we have hair or we don't have hair, it doesn't matter. We are all made visible because God loves all of us. We are all created equally, and that we should also be making creation visible too. This week in my class and intro, it was about the doctrine of humanity and how sometimes when the church has made human beings, at the top. And so, within Christianity, you can subdue the earth or you can dominate over the earth. That has been misinterpreted so many ways to say we can do whatever we want with the earth and kill anything that we want or destroy whatever we want. The rainforest, hey, we can destroy it because we are the best of all of God's creation. So all this misinterpretation, but I think the visibility, I think we need to give visibility of all of God's creation. And earlier when I spoke about Han, this unjust suffering, because of the lack of time, I focus on human beings, but I always extend it to all of God's creation. When we think about the earth groaning, we are having extreme weather because of this climate change, because of the carbon emissions, because of our ways of living and the pollution that we are creating. The earth is experiencing Han. The animals are experiencing Han. There have been recent photographs of polar bears, like skin and bones. They should be big, but there is nothing for them to eat because of the pollution. So the earth is experiencing Han. The air is experiencing Han. This is the experiencing of unjust suffering, this deep pain because of climate injustice, because of the way we have set up the system and we are causing pain. So this theology of visibility, and hopefully I will develop it even further. This is just an initial stab at it, but I have to develop it more. Maybe that will be another book. So thank you for asking me that question. I have to think about it more too.
Beautiful. There's so many really moving questions that are coming in. I'd like to pick up one from Alicia, who writes that she is currently reading your book, and as a South Asian woman, really deeply resonated with your anger of being minimized to the idea of an ethnic tribe rather than our individual selves. So she asks if you could speak more about how this erases our visibility as Asian American women and how it links to intersectional disempowerment.
Intersectional, sorry?
Disempowerment.
Disempowerment. Yes, because, this invisibility kind of works together with all of the intersecting forms of oppression. So invisibility, as Dr. Besner said, it erases our history. People don't study it. People don't find importance. It erases what happened to Asian women who came. So because the bulk of the workers, the indentured workers, were men, the women that came were made into prostitutes. There was a lot of assault against women because they were viewed in a very bad light. That's why we have stories like Madame Butterfly and Miss Saigon, how women are treated as sex objects. And we see this played over and over again. The hypersexualization of Asian women, Asian American women, and the desexualization of Asian American men. Anyway, this erasure of our experiences, even the Japanese internment, we don't want to talk about it as much in the white dominant society. We don't want to explain and share how they lived in these really paper thin buildings where it was extremely hot in the summer and extremely cold in the wintertime. They lost everything. Can you imagine waking up and losing everything overnight? So there is a lot of erasure, and I think we really need to do something to say, hey, I am a person. I am a worthy person. I am God's child. I am important. And what I say is also important. When I think in the theological world, there is a lot of invisibility of Asian American work, Asian American theology, and particularly Asian American women's theology. We are kind of pushed aside, cast aside. We are not important. We have to listen to the white men because they are saying whatever is correct. And if I keep bringing in the Asian culture, Asian words, that is all wrong. But when we look at the whole Christian history, all the white men did exactly what I am actually doing. They brought in pagan practices. They brought in their own words. The German theologians for spirit use Geist. I'm just bringing in an Asian term, Qi, doing the exact same thing. So, they were doing it. They were bringing their own experiences. Anselm's theory of atonement, he was bringing his own experiences. Augustine, his whole problem with women and his own sexuality and etc. He brought all that in when he was writing his theology and talking about sin and the city of God. We see this, but when Asian American women or other women of color do this, we are pushed aside and our voices are not heard. And this is very true of Asian American women's and Asian American theology. So that's why I really want to develop even further this theology of visibility so that we can lift Asian Americans' voices, and the white dominant society will see us for who we are and treat us equally. We are citizens in this land, just like a white British immigrant that came yesterday. They can come yesterday, they're accepted. We can be here for generations, and we are called perpetual foreigners. continually. And if you are called the foreigner, then it is very easy to blame you when a pandemic happens, when there is job loss, when the economy goes down. We are blamed continuously. And just a quick note, because I know we're running out of time. In the book of Ezra, after the exile and they came back, there were a large group of foreign women, and the men all got together and they thought, what should we do with the foreign women? And they were cast aside. And so that is just one biblical example, but it continues to happen today. And when we look at the Japanese internment, we were against the Germans during the war. We didn't intern any Germans. And so that happens. So I think we really need to understand our history. We cannot continue to marginalize Asian American and be sexist and racist and legalize discrimination by what Congress has done from 1882 until today. There are all these laws that continue to discriminate against us, and we need to stop. So I want to develop further the theology of visibility.
Final question that we'll ask today comes from Ashaya, who is, thinking about the way you talked about the model minority myth and the way that affects Black people, the way the term Han expresses pain and suffering that communities experience. So Ashaya asks, what can Black, Indigenous, and other people of color do to unite while also acknowledging the different experiences of those among us? Let's use that as the closing question. So Dr. Kim, if you'd be willing to speak to that.
Yeah, that's an excellent closing question. I think it is so important to be in solidarity. That's why with the Black Lives Movement, we said Asians are for Black lives. We need to be in solidarity with other people of color. We need to stand up for the Indigenous, the Native American people. When we think about the genocide that has happened, we don't talk about it as much. Only 2% are alive. And we need to do something about our past. When we think about the Mexican land, we stole so much of the Mexican land, and what we do at the border and how we treat Hispanics here in this country, the Latinx community. I think we need to be aware of our history and how racism and how this model minority myth pits us against one another. Because once it does that, white supremacy works so well, and white people will continue to have power over us. And I do talk a little bit about power in the book too. So, we do need to talk about decentering, and we also need to be talking about being in solidarity. We need to love each other. I know there is fear amongst even amongst us people of color. We are afraid of each other. We're afraid that they will take our jobs, or we're afraid that they may do something to our community. We have to get rid of this fear, and we need to be able to work with one another and live with one another. Now there are interracial marriages, interracial children. We need to be able to live with acceptance. We need to be able to live with Chong, the sticky love. I think when we think, when Christians were talking about love, we talked about eros and philos, and now I can't remember all the 3 Greek terms because I've been talking about, you can probably help me. But anyway, we talk in those Greek terms, but hey, why don't we listen to other languages and other communities? For a long time in theology, Africans helped us with the term Ubuntu theology and an Ubuntu understanding. I exist with you and you exist with me. We don't exist without each other. And in the same way, this community of us, our Udi, at the end of the day, especially in theology, we only have words. And so words are so important. As kids, we say, sticks and bones may not, what is this? Sticks and bones may not hurt, but words may, anyway, the saying better than me. But words are powerful. And what kids said to me during kindergarten, I still remember, and I am like middle-aged now. Words are powerful. They can build us up or they can destroy us. People commit suicide over words because it has been so painful and so damaging. So that's why words are so important. We need more languages because we are finite human beings. We are worshiping this infinite God. So we need more words to help us describe our experiences, describe how we are to love one another, how we are to exist with one another in solidarity. So we need to get rid of honorific whites. We need to get rid of model minority. We need to get rid of perpetual foreigner. We need to get rid of xenophobia from our own kind of understanding. There's a lot of things that we need to kind of eliminate and work towards a theology of visibility that uplifts everyone. It doesn't matter who you are, doesn't matter how you look, doesn't matter, that God loves all of us and we are called to do likewise. It's so hard to do it, but I always say, with the Spirit of God, it is so hard to do it ourselves, but with the Spirit of God, we can do it. We can be in solidarity, we can love each other, and we can build a better church, better places of worship, better communities, better nation, and a better world. So thank you so much for all your questions. I see there are so many. I haven't opened up the box, but I would love to continue to engage, but I know people have classes and other things to go to tonight. So thank you so much. And thank you for inviting me. I'm so thrilled to be invited by Georgetown.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kim, for a beautiful, powerful, inspiring conversation and for the gift of your time and your words. So it's truly been our honor to have you here tonight. Thank you to everyone.
It was an honor to be with you too.
Beautiful. All right. Good night, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining me. Good night.